I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. My name is Emma Kami, and I will be your host today. Sudan descended into conflict on April 15th when the Sudanese Armed Forces clashed with a local paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces. Since then, international players like the United States, the European Union, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others have attempted to broker ceasefires between the warring sides, but have so far failed. Here with me today is Clara Brackbill, a Sub-Saharan Africa analyst at RANE. Welcome, Clara.
Hi, Emma.
At this point in time, Sudan is about 11 days into the conflict. So what's the latest on what's happening?
Yes, so on April 24th, around midnight, there was news that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had successfully brokered a 72-hour ceasefire between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. But quickly after, the ceasefire appeared to not be holding in parts of Khartoum in particular, and also in the neighboring city of Omdurman. So while fighting has continued in Khartoum, this is the third ceasefire that's fallen through since the outbreak of violence on April 15th. The story across the country is not uniform. Apparently, there are some local community groups that have successfully brokered a cessation of hostilities in some parts of Darfur, but as I said, fighting and troop movements around the presidential palace, the international airport, and military bases in Khartoum are ongoing today, April 26th. There's also news that some ethnic militias are also arming or rearming in preparation to join the fight, which of course just further obscures the picture of what's going on and who holds what territory. So far, over 450 people have been killed in the fighting and over 3,700 injured. And the UN is reporting that the paramilitary RSF is using similar tactics to those it employed during the 2003 war in Darfur, including mass killings, rape, and torture. And then, as both groups are vying for control of the capital, the leaders of those groups for the paramilitary group, the RSF, that would be Hamedi, and then for the SAF, that would be General al-Burhan. Both leaders appear to think that a military victory over the other is possible, which will just continue to extend violence as well as erode the semblance of law and order that remains, as well as command and control systems that will likely further break down as fighting persists. The UN has also announced that it expects violence to actually escalate in the next 48 hours due to reports that the SAF will increase the use of air assets to target the positions, bases, and supply lines of the RSF, which means that both Sudanese and foreigners that are still stuck in Khartoum can expect heavy bombing and fighting in the next 48 hours.
And how do you see the fighting evolving over the coming weeks?
Well, in coming days and potentially weeks, the most likely scenario is that urban fighting in Khartoum, Omdurman, and neighboring cities persists. But with the presence of sporadic and potentially uneven ceasefires like the one that we saw a couple days ago. At this point, a permanent ceasefire is improbable, given the remarks by both Burhan and Hamedi, as well as dissent and factionalism within the military and the RSF, that will likely, lead to the increased likelihood of miscalculations and the breaking of even temporary ceasefires in some areas. There are also hardliners within both groups, within both the SAF and the RSF, that continue to oppose any ceasefire. So with that in mind, with the continuation of fighting, international partners, Arab states like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, will very likely continue to pressure both groups to at least temporarily halt fighting. With that in mind, though, the SAF and RSF, at least in terms of personnel on the ground, are somewhat evenly matched. However, the military has a significant advantage in terms of air power. So as we extend the time horizon, then, even if fighting on the ground in terms of gun battles persists in Khartoum and Omdurman, the likelihood that the SAF will successfully relegate the RSF to peripheral areas around the country increases. So over the medium term, we may actually see what has started as concentrated urban warfare in Khartoum morph into a sort of insurgency-like conflict, with the RSF attempting to regroup in peripheral areas, potentially Darfur, given the RSF's historical connection to the region. The RSF emerged out of the Arab Janjaweed, which is one of the key forces in the 2003 Darfur War. And then the RSF would then carry out strikes on military positions as well as civilian targets, with SAF forces continuing to attempt to root out RSF combatants. And such a battle has the potential to become a protracted conflict that lasts months or years and plunges Sudan as well as the region into a new humanitarian crisis.
If Sudan does become embroiled in a protracted civil war, what are the regional implications to that?
Yes, so if the conflict ends up being has an extended timeline and remains and fighting remains at a high caliber between the two sides, the regional fallout could be massive. First and foremost, the humanitarian cost is likely to be extremely high. Khartoum is a large city, and continued fighting is likely to push millions of refugees into not only more rural parts of Sudan, but also to push refugees attempting to flee into neighboring countries like Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan. And even though fighting has only been ongoing, as you said, for about 11 days, we've already seen about 20,000 refugees attempting to enter South Sudan through Sudan's border. The Chadian military has also reportedly closed its border with Sudan and deployed a concentration of troops there. But porous borders on all sides are likely to lead to outflows. There's also very likely to be a high political cost of the ongoing fighting. So when the conflict broke out on the 15th, Sudan was in the process of negotiating a transition to civilian rule between Burhan, the military, Hemedti, the RSF, and civilian factions. Now that Sudan has descended into this conflict, the prospect of civilian leadership is far less likely, as the winner of this current conflict will very likely install himself and his cronies in a top leadership position, and potentially use ongoing fighting as evidence that Sudan isn't ready, and I'm using air quotes there, for civilian rule. And then with that, there are also regional security consequences. So with a massive humanitarian catastrophe, that creates an opportunity ripe for exploitation by the myriad armed groups that are operating in and around Sudan, that would very likely attempt to take advantage of the chaos that a prolonged civil war would bring. And this could take the form of exploiting smuggling routes, increased insecurity, attempting to exploit the wartime economy to achieve their own disparate ends. And these could be criminal groups, they could be groups with certain ideologies like jihadist groups. It really runs the gamut. And then the longer that the war drags on, the messier it's likely to be in terms of foreign backing. So we already know that Egypt supports the SAF, the Sudanese military, and there's recent evidence that suggests that the Russian paramilitary Wagner group supports the RSF, the paramilitary group, and has provided them with some materials in the recent fighting. But additional partners like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, may have more incentive to become more heavily involved as a peaceful resolution becomes, more and more distant as fighting continues. In the short term, a peaceful resolution to the conflict is certainly most compatible with regional parties' political and commercial interests. No one wants a crisis in Sudan, or I should say a protracted crisis in Sudan. But as I said, the risk that countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE will back their preferred actor with more money, weapons, and other forms of military support increases the longer that the conflict persists, and the longer that external parties become more concerned over power and influence in Sudan. So yes, I would say we could break those into three buckets: the humanitarian cost, the political cost, and the cost to regional security.
Well, thank you very much for that analysis. You can learn how geopolitical events like this could affect your business with RANE Worldview. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.